Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. We're going to dive into a very important and complex topic understanding racism and prejudice. Throughout this presentation, we'll explore what these terms really mean, how they differ from each other, look at some real life examples, and discuss the social impacts they have on individuals and communities. It's a critical conversation, and I'm looking forward to exploring it together with you. Racism is a belief that inherent differences between races determine who is superior or inferior. This mindset often leads to discrimination or hostility towards certain racial groups. On the other hand, prejudice involves forming opinions or feelings about people without real knowledge or experience. These judgments are usually based on stereotypes or biases rather than facts. Understanding these definitions is crucial because both racism and prejudice harm individuals and societies by fostering inequality and misunderstanding. When we talk about the differences between racism and prejudice, it's important to understand that racism always involves race and is closely tied to systems of power within society. It's not just about individual feelings, but about how these racial biases are supported and maintained by larger social structures. On the other hand, prejudice is a broader concept. It refers to preconceived opinions about any group, not just race, and doesn't necessarily involve systemic power or institutional backing. Racism often shows up as systemic discrimination, which means it's built into laws, policies, and institutional practices that disadvantage certain racial groups. Prejudice, however, is more about attitude. It's the feelings or biases people hold, which may or may not result in discriminatory actions. Also, prejudice can target any group, whether based on gender, religion, or other characteristics, while racism is specific to race. Another key point is that racism is usually deeply embedded and reinforced throughout society, making it widespread and persistent, whereas prejudice can be more personal and isolated, varying greatly from one individual to another. Let's look at some concrete examples of racism to better understand how it manifests in society. First, racial segregation laws historically enforced separate facilities for different races, creating systemic barriers in education, transportation, and public spaces. Then, there's employment discrimination, where qualified individuals are unfairly denied jobs simply because of their race, limiting economic opportunities. Hate crimes represent another severe aspect, involving violence or intimidation targeted specifically at people based on their racial group. In housing, practices like redlining denied loans or housing options to certain racial communities, deepening economic inequality. Lastly, racial profiling by law enforcement results in specific racial groups being disproportionately targeted, which undermines trust and perpetuates injustice. These examples highlight how racism operates at many levels and in various settings. When we talk about prejudice, it helps to look at some common examples to understand how it shows up in everyday life. First, there's gender based judgment, where people make negative assumptions about someone solely because of their gender, without really knowing them. This can unfairly limit opportunities or affect how someone is treated. Another example is religious assumptions, where individuals might avoid others just because they belong to a different faith, based on stereotypes about their beliefs or behavior. Then we have nationality stereotypes, which involve attributing certain traits or behaviors to people just because of their country of origin. This oversimplifies people's identities and can lead to unfair treatment. Political prejudice is also common, where people dismiss or dislike others simply because of their political views, without any meaningful conversation or understanding. Finally, disability preconceptions are assumptions that people make about those with disabilities, often leading to social exclusion or underestimated abilities. All of these examples highlight how prejudice can create unnecessary barriers and misunderstandings. Racism leads to systemic inequalities that affect crucial areas of life, such as education, employment, healthcare, and the justice system, creating barriers that disproportionately impact marginalized groups. Prejudice, while often rooted in personal bias, can extend beyond individuals to divide communities and reinforce discriminatory practices. Both racism and prejudice have serious psychological effects, causing stress, anxiety, and lowering self esteem for those targeted. Additionally, racism plays a significant role in maintaining cycles of poverty and social exclusion by upholding institutional obstacles that limit opportunities. Finally, if prejudice goes unaddressed, It can escalate into more blatant forms of discrimination and even spark social conflict, threatening cohesion and fairness in society. Here, we summarize the differences between racism and prejudice. Racism is primarily race-based and often systemic, meaning it's embedded within institutions and societal structures. It involves collective power, making its impact more widespread and deeply rooted in society. On the other hand, prejudice refers to biased attitudes that individuals hold against any group. It's more personal and attitudinal, not necessarily linked to systemic power. Despite these differences, both racism and prejudice lead to harmful social and personal consequences that affect individuals and communities alike.